I think Judge Priest of 1934 is a very strong film, admirably photographed, a rich script, and rather likably performed. Will Rogers in the titular role. Judge Priest is more well known as the film was remade as the sun, somewhat remade as the Sunshine's Bride of 1953 is based off of the same literary character by the author Owen Cobb, I believe his name is, and that film was notable for part of Ford's motivation for remaking the film was that scenes in the original Judge Priest that were set to focus on racial tensions and, for instance, the character defending his friend Jim from being attacked by a lynch mob. These scenes were cut from the film. I don't know whether at the scripting level or whether these were filmed and then excised from the print. And that apparently that was part of Ford's motivation for retelling the same story, nearly 20 years later, when I suppose the studio execs were more forward or accepting of these sort of ideas. Anyway, so I think where I wanted to bring up, what I wanted to talk about with Judge Priest was partly comparing it to another of Ford's films. See, I feel like Judge Priest is interesting in that it doesn't diminish the seriousness of some of its narrative threads, although it has a sort of light-hearted, genial, sort of measured, optimistic approach to these issues. It's a Christian film, but it's bizarrely Buddhist in its outlook. We could argue. What one thing I'd like to compare this film positively to Ford's film Dr. Bull. Now, Dr. Bull, I felt, dealt with its issues in a... It seemed to diminish the seriousness of the issues, although those issues, the topics within Dr. Bull are quite serious. You have I feel it's typhoid outbreak, and it's about him having an affair with this other woman, but ultimately they're just played as like cheap drama around the sort of typical Hollywood happy ending scaffold. And I was quite struck, and I read this passage out in a previous upload. It's Jean-Marie Straub, who we've discussed a fair bit on this channel in the last year. He considered Dr. Bull as the birth of neorealism in cinema, which is interesting. I mean, I don't know if it's really revolutionizing much, which... I mean, birth of neorealism in cinema, that's an interesting question. In terms of trying to convey a distinct, cogent, identifiable social realism, we might take it back to, of all people, strangely enough, Chaplin with Woman of Paris in 1923. And even the year before that, the film's lost mostly, but Ford's The Village Blacksmith seems to suggest that Ford himself was exploring this territory. And even to some extent, though it's a kind of a Baroque film, there is a certain historical honesty about the Iron Horse. And even in its depiction of the Native Americans, they're the antagonists of the film, although they are portrayed as a fairly dignified and motivated people, and not entirely cartoonishly as they could have been portrayed in subsequent decades, especially where television portrayals were concerned of the Old West. Yikes. So I'm a bit surprised by Jean-Marie Straub's take on Dr. Bull there. I wasn't as overwhelmingly impressed with the film. I'm not going to be discussing it on the retrospective as a result. I'm not that surprised that Straub was looking for like some sort of like, exciting take, because, when you read that, you're like, it kind of sticks out at you. And that's kind of what you want when you write about films, although, like, I feel as though I can't write downstream of, like, snappy statements, you know what I mean? Like, I find that a bit difficult. I mean, I'm sure I've done it occasionally, although it's not the norm for me. I don't know if I can come up with overwhelmingly snappy headlines without some sort of substance to motivate myself to do so. Maybe I'm complimenting myself a bit too much. Probably am. Anyway, look, Judge Priest, I don't think it's stronger than the early 50s film. I saw the Sunshine's Bright some years ago, and I was very impressed with it. And so seeing Judge Priest afterward You feel like you're watching sort of a prototype more than anything else. Although it stands up on its own, Will Rogers is extremely likable, watchable, and rather three dimensional character. This Judge Priest, Paphos. No, I think it's a strong film, and I would sincerely recommend it for anyone who wants to dive into Ford's films of the 30s. It doesn't quite. I mean, there is a degree of racial insensitivity. I mean, we could question the degree that portrayed sympathetically and as positive characters, although it's a bit cartoonish and condescending. Not too much alike Prisoner of Shark Island, which is a really strong film which Ford made in '36. And sometimes I wonder, like, if that would be my go-to Ford film. But, well, from the perspective of, like, if I'm recommending it to people around me in Australia, like, they're not really interested in Yank storylines like that. And normally I'm not either, unless John Ford directs it, to be fair. But most people don't, if you're really interested in the art of film composition, I mean, you don't have to be, obviously. But, me being that sort of person, I find a lot to intensely admire about Ford's work, naturally. And with Prisoner of Shark Island, it's harder to recommend that to, I think, something like Judge Priest with its kind of straightforward but sort of all-encompassing universal storyline. It's not too American, despite it being set in the Deep South. It's a really evocative narrative. Even something like Mary of Scotland might be a bit too Catholic or religious for certain people, especially in today's day and age, frankly. And the Hurricane might be seen as a bit hokey, a bit condescending, as sort of a set in sort of a tribal context. We'll get to that one. I think that's a really interesting film, at least compositionally. And of course, some people aren't into westerns or John Wayne, so Stagecoach is a no. I think that's one of his, and most people think it's one of his best films of the '30s. The '30s probably my favorite John Ford decade. I think John Ford in black and white might be the more interesting John Ford, as much as we appreciate some of his colour efforts, like The Searchers and Gideon of Scotland Yard, Seven Women, Sergeant Rutledge is a terrific film, actually. There is something to be said for how Ford was the most captivating of the Hollywood directors of the '30s, quite possibly. I mean, I like Michael Curtiz, I like James Whale, although I don't think they were as consistent with their pictures as Ford was. And I mean, we can think of. I mean, Lang had a few films out in the '30s, to be fair, and they're really strong. Not all of them are plausibly the best of his in that decade. That's not a Hollywood film, so if it were, we could probably count Lang as the best Hollywood director of the '30s, but it would be kind of cheating to do so. Or not. I mean, his '30s films are quite strong anyway. We'll close it here.